Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, between 4:15 and 5:45 a.m., I deliver fresh floral arrangements to 17 cemeteries across Hardin County, Kentucky. Roses, carnations, seasonal mixed bouquets, the occasional custom piece for an anniversary or a birthday the dead will never celebrate. The flowers come from a wholesale distributor out of Louisville. The van is mine. The route is mine. The contract is mine now. But the original vendor, a woman named Maren Selby, who operated a small shop called Selby's Florals and Remembrance out of a converted gas station on Route 86, closed her business in November of 2006. The shop has been boarded up for almost 20 years. The county directory still lists it as active, and 3 of the 17 cemeteries on my route receive arrangements I did not order, did not load, and cannot account for. They appear in the passenger seat of my van between stops, wrapped in paper printed with a logo that hasn't existed since 2006. The paper is always warm. My name is Joel Cates. I'm 38 years old, and I've been running floral delivery for the Southern Kentucky Cemetery Circuit since March of 2021. Before that, I drove refrigerated freight out of Bowling Green for almost a decade. Perishables. Produce, mostly, some dairy. I knew cold chain logistics. I understood delivery windows, temperature control, the mathematics of decay. When the pandemic hollowed out the supply chain and my company folded its regional division, I was sitting in an empty apartment with a paid-off cargo van and no prospects. My mother, who had lived in Hardin County her entire life, mentioned that the Cemetery Association had been struggling to find a reliable floral vendor since the last contractor quit without notice in late 2019. Before him, there had been 2 others since Maren Selby closed. None of them lasted more than 18 months. My mother didn't say why. She just said the route was available and the county paid on time. The pay was modest. 17 cemeteries, 2 deliveries per week, with surge orders around Memorial Day, Easter, and Christmas. The cemeteries ranged from well-maintained county-managed facilities with paved roads and irrigation systems to rural family plots barely visible from the road. Some had groundskeepers. Most didn't. My job was straightforward. Pick up the wholesale order from the Louisville distributor Monday and Wednesday evenings. Store them overnight in the cargo area of my van utility shed or covered alcove near the main gate, where I'd leave the arrangements with the corresponding invoice. For the first 3 months, everything was ordinary. The work was quiet. I liked the quiet. Driving through rural Kentucky before dawn, the headlights cutting through fog that sat heavy in the valleys between the hills, passing farmhouses where a single kitchen light burned above a sink. The silence of cemeteries at that hour felt less like death and more like patience, like the ground was waiting without urgency. I found it calming after years of highway driving, loading docks, the constant pressure of spoilage timelines. Flowers have their own spoilage timeline, of course, but there's something gentler about it. A rose doesn't rot the way a pallet of strawberries does. It folds. It closes back into itself like it's remembering how to be a bud. I started noticing the discrepancies in June of 2021. The first time, I was making my 3rd stop of the morning at Green Hill Memorial Gardens, a mid-sized county cemetery about 12 miles south of Elizabethtown. Green Hill was one of the more active sites. They had a part-time groundskeeper named Dale who came in around 7, and a small chapel that the county rented out for services. My delivery there was usually 8 to 12 arrangements depending on the week. I'd loaded exactly 9 that morning. I remembered because I'd counted them twice at my van after the Louisville pickup, matched them against the invoice, and noted that one of the orders was a custom piece with a specific ribbon that read, "Beloved Grandmother." I always double-checked custom pieces. Mistakes with those were personal. When I opened the van at Green Hill, there were 10 arrangements. The 10th was a simple bouquet, white carnation, baby's breath, and a single stem of pale lavender. It was wrapped in brown paper with a printed logo I didn't recognize, not the Louisville distributor's branding, something older. The ink was a faded burgundy, and the text read, "Selby's Florals and Remembrance," above a small illustration of a lily. Below the logo, in smaller type, it said, Route 86, Hardin County, KY. The paper felt warm, not like it had been sitting near the engine, but warm the way skin is warm, like it had been held. There was no invoice, no delivery tag, no order number, just the bouquet, sitting upright in the passenger seat of my van, as if someone had placed it there with care while I was carrying the other 9 arrangements to the Green Hill storage alcove. The van had been locked. The parking area was empty. Dawn was still 40 minutes away, and the only light came from a single lamp at the cemetery gate. I stood there holding the bouquet, turning it over, looking for some kind of identifying information. The stems were freshly cut. The water at the base of the wrapping was clean. These flowers hadn't been sitting anywhere for long. I didn't know what Selby's Florals was at the time. The name meant nothing to me. I assumed it was a remnant from a previous order, maybe something left in the van by the contractor before me, something that had slipped behind a panel and worked itself loose. I couldn't explain the freshness of the flowers, but I'm a practical person. I told myself there was an explanation and decided to figure it out later. I left the bouquet at Green Hill's delivery point alongside the other 9 arrangements and finished my route. The second time it happened was the following Thursday at a different cemetery, Holly Creek, a small rural plot about 4 miles off the main highway, accessible by a single-lane gravel road that wound through a stand of old-growth hickory trees. Holly Creek had no groundskeeper, no chapel, no gate, just a stone wall about 3 feet high, enclosing maybe 200 graves, the oldest dating to 1847. My standard delivery there was 2 arrangements placed on a wooden shelf inside a small tin-roofed shed near the entrance. I loaded 2 that night. When I opened the van at Holly Creek, there were 3. Same wrapping, same logo, same warmth. This time the arrangement was different. Yellow roses, tightly bunched, with a sprig of rosemary tucked into the center. Rosemary for remembrance. That detail bothered me more than the appearance itself because it suggested intention, not a random leftover, a composed arrangement with symbolic content, made by someone who understood the language of funeral floristry, someone who knew what rosemary meant when placed among roses at a cemetery. I searched the van that morning, every compartment, behind the cooling unit, under the floor mats, in the door panels. Nothing. No hidden inventory, no old stock, no explanation for how a fresh bouquet wrapped in paper from a defunct flower shop appeared in a locked vehicle between delivery stops. The van's cargo area had 1 sliding door on the passenger side and the rear double doors, all of which I locked with a keyed deadbolt. The cab was locked with the factory fob. None of the locks showed tampering. When I got home that afternoon, I looked up Selby's Florals in remembrance. The internet had very little. A defunct business listing on a county commerce page. A brief mention in a 2003 Elizabethtown News Enterprise article about small businesses serving the memorial industry. 1 photograph, taken for a Chamber of Commerce directory, showing a small clapboard building with a hand-painted sign and a front window crowded with arrangements. The woman standing in the doorway was small, maybe 5'2", with dark hair pulled back and an apron that was more soil than fabric. That was Maren Selby. The caption identified her as the owner and sole proprietor, in operation since 1979. The article noted that she personally delivered to every cemetery in the county, driving a Ford Econoline van that she kept until the odometer stopped working somewhere past 300,000 miles. She had served the county for 27 years. Then, in November 2006, she closed without announcement. The shop was boarded up within a week. No forwarding address, no sale, no transfer of the delivery contract. The county scrambled to find a replacement, and from what I could piece together from the sparse records, the contract changed hands 4 times between 2007 and 2020 before I took it. My predecessor, a man named Gerald Huff, lasted 14 months. Before him, a woman named Tricia Sorensen lasted 9. Before Tricia, a semi-retired florist from Radcliffe, lasted 11 months and reportedly refused to discuss why he quit. None of this was available in any organized form. I assembled it from county meeting minutes, scattered online mentions, and one conversation with my mother, who remembered Maren Selby the way most people in the county seemed to remember her. Vaguely, fondly, without detail. She was just always there, my mother said. You'd see her van on the road before sunrise. She was a cemetery person. You know the type. Quiet, kept her own hours, kept to herself. Nobody seemed to know where Maren went after she closed. Nobody seemed to have asked. The bouquets kept appearing. Not every delivery. Not on any pattern I could initially identify. But 2 to 3 times per month I would open the van at a cemetery and find an extra arrangement wrapped in that warm, burgundy printed paper. The compositions varied, sometimes simple, sometimes elaborate. Once, in August of that year, I found a piece built around dried wheat stalks and sunflowers that was more sculptural than floral, something that would have taken a skilled arranger at least an hour to construct. Each one was fresh. Each one was warm. None of them had invoices. I started logging them. Date, time, cemetery, composition, placement in the van, weather conditions, anything I could record. The refrigerated freight driver in me needed data. If something was happening that I couldn't explain, I could at least document it until a pattern emerged. By September of 2021, I had logged 14 phantom arrangements across 7 cemeteries. And a pattern did emerge, though it wasn't the kind I was hoping for. The bouquets only appeared at cemeteries where my route took me between 4:45 and 5:30 a.m. Never at the first stop when full darkness still held. Never at the later stops when dawn had broken. Only during that transitional window. That bruised gray light that isn't night anymore, but isn't morning yet either. The threshold hour, my mother used to call it, when she'd wake me for school. The time when the world is changing its mind about what it wants to be. And the bouquets only appeared when I was outside the van. I tested this. In October, at my 4th stop, Calvary Hill, I stayed in the cab with the engine running and watched the cargo area through the rearview mirror for 20 minutes. Nothing appeared. I stepped out, carried my legitimate deliveries to the shed, and returned. A bundle of white lilies wrapped in warm brown paper sat on the passenger seat. I'd been gone less than 4 minutes. That was the night I drove to Route 86 to find Selby's Florals in remembrance. The building was still there, set back from the road about 30 feet, flanked by overgrown cedar trees that had grown together into a wall of dark green. The clapboard siding was gray with age. The hand-painted sign was gone, but the mounting brackets remained. 2 rusted iron arms extending from the facade like something waiting to hold a weight that had been removed. The windows were boarded with plywood that had warped and split along the grain. The front door was plywood too, screwed directly into the frame. Someone had spray-painted "Condemned" across it in orange, but the paint had faded to a pale salmon color that looked less like a warning and more like a blush. The parking area was cracked asphalt with weeds pushing through in thick clumps. An old fuel island stood to the left, a relic from the building's previous life as a gas station. The pumps were gone, but the concrete pad remained, stained with decades of petroleum and rainwater. I sat in my van with the engine idling and the headlights painting the building in flat white light. It looked like every other abandoned roadside business in rural Kentucky. Unremarkable. Finished. Waiting for someone to either tear it down or let the woods take it back. But the air coming through my partially open window smelled like flowers. Not decay, not the musty sweetness of decomposition. Fresh flowers, green stems and pollen, and that bright, clean note that roses carry in the first hour after they're cut. The smell was strong enough that I checked the van's cargo area, thinking one of the phantom bouquets had appeared. It hadn't. The smell was coming from the building. I did not go inside that night. I drove home, locked my apartment door, and sat at my kitchen table with my delivery log open and the county directory loaded on my laptop. The directory listed Selby's Florals in remembrance as active. Status operational. Last inspection pending. Contact Maren Selby, proprietor. Phone number disconnected. The listing had not been updated since 2006. 20 years of county database audits, and no one had changed the status of a business that hadn't existed for 2 decades. Or maybe they had tried and the database wouldn't let them. I called the county clerk's office the next morning. A woman named Denise, who had worked there since the early 90s, answered. I told her I was the current cemetery floral contractor and had a question about a previous vendor listing. She was pleasant enough. I asked about Selby's Florals and Remembrance, why the directory still showed it as active. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone is looking something up. The kind where someone is deciding how much to say. That listing's been flagged for correction a few times, Denise said. It just doesn't take. I asked what she meant by that. I mean, I've personally gone into the system and changed the status to closed. Twice. Both times it reverted within a week. IT said it was a database error. Some kind of legacy formatting issue with entries created before 2004. They were supposed to migrate everything to the new system in 2015. But there were a handful of records that wouldn't transfer. Selby's was one of them. I asked if she remembered Maren Selby. Everybody knew Maren, Denise said. She was one of those people who's just part of the county, like the water tower or the courthouse clock. You don't think about them until they're gone, and then you can't believe you never paid more attention. She paused again. She came in here every quarter to renew her vendor permit. Always paid in cash. Always brought me a little arrangement for my desk. Carnations, usually. She said carnations were honest flowers, nothing fancy about them. They just do their job. I asked if Denise knew why Maren closed. Nobody knows, she said. One week the shop was open. The next week it was boarded up. I drove by a few days after, and the lights were off. I figured maybe she'd had a health scare or a family situation, but nobody ever heard from her again. No forwarding address at the post office. No death certificate in the county records. She just stopped. Denise said this with the calm finality of someone who had long ago decided not to be disturbed by it. Small towns absorb disappearances differently than cities do. A person can vanish into the landscape the same way a closed shop vanishes into the roadside. You drive past it 1,000 times, and eventually you stop seeing it. I drove past it every delivery morning. 2 weeks after that phone call, I went back to Route 86. This time in daylight, a Saturday afternoon in late October, when the trees along the road were burning gold and copper, and the air had that cold clarity that autumn in Kentucky carries like a signature. I brought a pry bar, a flashlight, and the specific intention of getting inside. Not because I expected to find Maren Selby sitting behind a counter arranging carnations, because the bouquets kept coming, and the log I was keeping had grown to 23 entries, and the practical part of my mind demanded a physical explanation, even as the rest of me was beginning to accept that one might not exist. The plywood over the front door came away with less resistance than I expected. The screws were rusted through. The wood split along the old holes and fell in 2 pieces. Behind it, the original door was intact. A heavy wooden door with a glass panel in the upper half, the glass covered from inside with yellowed newspaper. The knob was brass, tarnished green. It turned without effort. The smell hit me before I crossed the threshold. Flowers. Overwhelming and specific. Not a general floral sweetness, but identifiable species layered over each other like voices in a choir. Rose, lily, carnation, chrysanthemum, lavender. Something sharper underneath that I eventually identified as fresh-cut greenery. Stems and leaves and the chlorophyll tang of living plants. The air was warm, not stuffy, not the trapped heat of a closed building. Warm the way a greenhouse is warm, humid and alive. The front room was small, maybe 15 feet by 20. A sales counter ran along the right wall, its surface covered in dust, but arranged with a precision that suggested the dust had settled on an organized workspace, not a cluttered one. Behind the counter, wooden shelving held rows of empty glass vases. A cash register, the old mechanical kind with round keys, sat at the near end of the counter. Its drawer was closed. A calendar hung on the wall behind the register. November 2006, the month Maren closed. The page showed a photograph of a meadow in autumn, and the days up through the 15th were crossed off with small, careful X marks in pencil. November 15th was a Wednesday. The 16th and every day after were blank. Whatever happened, It happened between the 15th and the 16th. The floor was worn linoleum, once white, now the color of old cream. Footprints were visible in the dust. My footprints following me from the door, and one other set, smaller, narrower. They led from behind the counter through a doorway at the back of the room. These prints were not dusty. They were clean impressions in the dust, as if someone had walked through within the past few days. The edges were sharp, no settling, no blurring. The back room was larger than I expected. It ran the full length of the building and had clearly been the old service garage before Marin converted it. The concrete floor sloped toward a drain in the center. Metal shelving lined the walls, and on those shelves I found what stopped me breathing for a moment. Arrangements. Dozens of them. Finished floral arrangements in various states of composition, some complete and wrapped in brown paper printed with the Selby's logo, others partially assembled with stems laid out in sequence on the work surface, as if the arranger had stepped away for a moment and intended to return. The wrapped bouquets were identical to the ones appearing in my van. Same paper, same logo, same careful construction. I touched one. It was warm. The flowers were fresh. I need to say that again because I stood in that room for a long time trying to rationalize it. The flowers were fresh, not preserved, not dried, not silk. Fresh-cut roses with water beading on the petals. Carnations with that specific firmness they have in the first 36 hours after harvest. Ferns with uncurled fronds still holding their spring tension. In a building that had been sealed for 20 years, with no water source, no refrigeration, no light, no soil, no planting medium of any kind. Fresh flowers arranged on a workbench in a closed shop on a dead stretch of highway, wrapped in paper from a business that ended in 2006. I counted the completed arrangements. 31. I checked my delivery log on my phone. Since June of 2021, 23 phantom bouquets had appeared in my van. I had not yet accounted for the 8 surplus arrangements on the bench. At the time, I assumed they were reserves, stock waiting to be delivered. The mathematics of that assumption didn't bother me then. It bothers me now. Deeper in the workshop, past the primary work table, I found a desk pushed against the far wall, a small wooden desk with a single drawer and a gooseneck lamp that, when I thumbed the switch out of reflex, turned on. The bulb was warm tone. The light it cast was amber, and in that light, the workshop looked less like an abandoned building and more like a room someone had left 5 minutes ago. A mug sat on the desk, empty but with a faint brown ring at the bottom. Coffee, maybe, or tea. Beside the mug was a spiral notebook with a green cover. I opened it. The handwriting was small and angular, written in pencil that had smudged in places. The first page was dated March 4th, 1979. The day Selby's Florals and Remembrance opened. The entry was short. First delivery, 12 arrangements, 7 cemeteries. Mr. Harlan Cobb at Green Hill was the only one waiting. He thanked me and said his wife would have liked the roses. She died in January. I told him carnations were what she would have wanted. He asked how I knew that. I didn't know how I knew that. The notebook was a delivery log. Every page a record of dates, cemeteries, arrangements, and small observations. Hundreds of entries spanning years. Marin Selby had documented every delivery she made for 27 years in this single notebook. And the notebook was thick, but not impossibly so, because her entries were brief, functional. The observations were where the personality lived, small notations in the margins. Oak Hill, April 12th, 1983. Left 6. Found 7 in the van when I got home. The 7th was for someone not yet buried. Calvary Hill, September 9th, 1991. The arrangement for Margaret Dean's plot rearranged itself between the van and the shed. The lilies moved to the outside. Margaret was allergic to lilies. She would have wanted them where she could see them, but they couldn't touch her. Holly Creek, January 3rd, 1998. Cold enough that the water in the stem should have frozen. It didn't. The temperature inside the van was 31 degrees. The flowers were warm. They are always warm when they come from somewhere else. Somewhere else. Marin used that phrase repeatedly throughout the notebook. Never defined, never explained. The flowers that appeared unbidden in her van came from somewhere else. The arrangements she didn't make were from somewhere else. She accepted this the way she seemed to accept everything, without drama, without fear, with the quiet competence of someone who understood that her job had dimensions she hadn't applied for but wasn't going to refuse. I sat at Marin's desk for over an hour reading that notebook. The gooseneck lamp hummed. The air smelled of roses and something deeper, something organic and warm that I associate now with root systems, the smell of things growing in dark places. Marin's entries moved through the years with a consistency that made her feel present in the room with me. She was meticulous. She cared about the work with an intensity that transcended commerce. These weren't products she was delivering. They were obligations. Every arrangement served a specific grave, and the phantom arrangements, the ones from somewhere else, always found their way to graves that needed them, graves that had no living family to place orders, graves that had been forgotten by everyone except the ground they occupied. In a 2001 entry, Marin wrote something that I've read so many times the words have worn smooth in my memory. I think the flowers are for the ones nobody visits. I think something keeps track of who's been forgotten and sends what it can. I don't know what that something is. I don't think it matters. The job is the same regardless. Pick up the flowers, deliver the flowers. Don't ask where the extras come from. They come because they're needed. The final entries were from November 2006. On November 14th, Marin wrote, "Delivery normal. 17 cemeteries. Standard orders plus 9 from somewhere else. More than usual. The paper was warmer today, nearly hot. Like the flowers were in a hurry. November 15th. Not a delivery day. Went to the shop to prepare Wednesday's inventory. Found the workshop full. Every surface covered. Arrangements I didn't make for people I don't know in quantities that aren't possible. The van is full, too. I opened it this morning and couldn't see the back wall. There must be 300 arrangements in there. The paper is burning hot. I can't hold them for more than a few seconds. Something has changed. Something needs more than I have been giving. I don't know if I can carry this." That was the last entry. The rest of the notebook was blank. I closed the notebook and sat in the amber light and listened to the building breathe. Because it was breathing. A slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the air pressure that I could feel in my eardrums. Not wind, not the HVAC system of an old building settling, a biological rhythm, inhalation, exhalation. The building was warm and humid and alive with the smell of flowers, and I understood, sitting there, that I was not in an abandoned shop. I was in something that had continued operating after its owner left. The shelves were stocked. The arrangements were fresh. The delivery log had ended, but the work had not. Something was still making flowers in this building. Something was still wrapping them in Selby's paper. And something was placing them in my van between stops, the way it had placed them in Marin's van for 27 years. The way it had perhaps placed them in vans before Marin, before the building was a flower shop, before the road was paved, before the cemeteries had fences and names. I took the notebook. I left everything else untouched. I pulled the plywood back across the door as best I could, drove home, and sat in my apartment until dark reading every entry from the beginning. Somewhere around the 1994 entries, a new detail emerged that I had missed on the first pass. Marin had started noting the graves where the phantom bouquets ended up, not where she placed them, where they ended up, because sometimes she'd place a phantom arrangement at the delivery shed, and by the time the groundskeeper arrived, it would be gone from the shed and sitting on a specific grave. She'd check the grave marker, record the name and dates. Over the years, she compiled a secondary list in the back of the notebook. 211 names. Every one of them a person buried in Hardin County with no surviving family, no memorial visitors, no one to bring flowers, the dead who had been completely forgotten by the living, and something remembered them anyway. I didn't sleep well that week. Not from fear, exactly. From the weight of it. The list of 211 names sat in my mind like an unpaid invoice. People who had lived and died in the same county where I now drove before dawn, whose graves received flowers from a source that couldn't be explained by any system I understood. I kept driving the route. The phantom bouquets kept appearing, but now, instead of logging them and moving on, I started following them. When a warm, brown paper arrangement showed up in my van, I would place it at the delivery point as usual and then return to the cemetery an hour later after dawn to see if it had moved. It always moved. The bouquets migrated to specific graves with a precision that eliminated any possibility of wind, animals, or groundskeeper interference. I'd find them centered on headstones, leaned carefully against markers, sometimes placed in built-in vases that I hadn't noticed were empty. The graves they chose were always older, weathered stone, faded inscriptions, plots in the back rows or along the fence lines, the zones of a cemetery that visitors rarely reach. I cross-referenced the names against Marin's list in the back of the notebook. Every single one matched. The phantom bouquets were going to the same graves Marin had documented, the same forgotten dead. In December of 2021, I did something I hadn't planned. I brought my own flowers, not from the wholesale order, not phantom arrangements. I stopped at a grocery store in Elizabethtown and bought a $12 bouquet of mixed carnations, wrapped them in plain cellophane, and brought them to Holly Creek Cemetery on a Thursday morning. I placed them on the grave of Elwyn Tate, born 1901, died 1949. Elwyn was on Marin's list. His headstone was a simple limestone rectangle, half sunk into the earth, with lichen growing in the carved letters of his name. No family plot, no adjacent graves with matching surnames. Just Elwyn, alone at the edge of the cemetery where the mowed grass gave way to wild chicory. When I came back that afternoon, my grocery store bouquet was gone. In its place was a fresh arrangement wrapped in Selby's paper, white carnations and rosemary, the same composition I'd found in my van months earlier. The paper was warm. A small tag was tucked into the stems, not a printed tag, a handwritten tag on cardstock in the same angular pencil handwriting from Marin's notebook. It read, Elwyn, faithful, one word of description, as if whoever or whatever was making these arrangements knew each person by more than their name, knew them by a quality, a characteristic, something essential that survived death and burial and decades of forgetting. I pulled out Marin's notebook that evening and looked more closely at the list of names. Some of them had annotations I'd initially overlooked, small words written beside the names in pencil so light it was nearly invisible. Ruth Aiken, patient. Harold Sumner, generous. Mary Flagg, brave. Not every name had an annotation. Maybe a third of them did. But the ones that did carried those single-word descriptions like epitaphs that had never been carved into stone, qualities that no obituary had recorded, qualities that someone or something still recognized. My mother came to visit me in January of 2022. She hadn't been to my apartment in Elizabethtown before, and she moved through the rooms with the careful attention mothers give to the spaces their children inhabit without them. She noticed the notebook on my kitchen table. I hadn't hidden it, partly because I didn't think she'd recognize it, and partly because I had started to feel a compulsion toward honesty about what was happening. The loneliness of carrying impossible knowledge is its own kind of weight, different from the knowledge itself. She picked up the notebook and went still. "Where did you get this?" she asked. I told her, all of it. The phantom bouquets, the warm paper, the building on Route 86, the fresh flowers in the sealed workshop, the delivery log, the list of names. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat down at the table. She ran her finger down the names until she found one. She tapped it twice. Cates, she said. Loretta Cates. Born 1887, died 1931. I looked. The name was there. Loretta Cates, listed between a Kenneth Briggs and a Doris Utterback. The annotation beside her name read, Steady. "That's your great-great-grandmother," my mother said. "Your father's side. She's buried at Oak Hill." Nobody's visited that grave in decades. Your father didn't even know where it was. His family wasn't the kind that kept up with things like that. She closed the notebook and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear, not surprise. Something closer to confirmation, as if a suspicion she'd carried for a long time had just been validated. Your grandmother talked about this, she said. Not directly. You know how she was. Everything sideways, everything half-said. But she told me once that the flowers in Hardin County take care of their own. I thought she was being poetic. She wasn't, was she? My mother didn't ask me to stop. She didn't tell me to be careful. She held the notebook for a long time, reading entries at random, and when she finally gave it back, she said, Marin couldn't carry it alone. Don't make her mistake. I didn't know what that meant until March. The frequency of the phantom bouquets increased through the winter. By February of 2022, I was finding 4 or 5 per delivery run. My van, which held the wholesale orders comfortably, with room to spare, began feeling crowded, not physically smaller. The spatial dimensions hadn't changed, but the presence of the extra arrangements created an atmosphere in the cargo area that was dense and warm and fragrant, beyond what the flowers alone could account for. Opening the sliding door was like opening the door to a room where someone had been working with intense concentration. The air was thick with purpose, and the paper was getting hotter. I'd been handling the Selby's wrapped bouquets with bare hands since the beginning. The warmth had been notable, but comfortable. By late February, the paper was hot enough to redden my palms, not burning, not painful exactly, but insistent, like holding a mug of coffee that someone keeps refilling. I started wearing the leather work gloves I'd used for freight handling. The heat came through anyway. After delivery, my hands would tingle for hours. On March 3rd, 2022, one day before the anniversary of Marin Selby's first delivery in 1979, I arrived at my van for the 4:15 morning run and couldn't open the cargo door, not because it was locked, because something was pressing against it from inside. The metal panel bowed outward when I tried the handle. I could feel heat radiating through the steel. The van's suspension was compressed, sitting low on its springs as if carrying a load far beyond its rated capacity. The windows were fogged with the condensation. Through the haze, I could see shapes, hundreds of them, bouquets packed floor to ceiling, their outlines visible through the misted glass like passengers in an overcrowded train. I stood in the cold March darkness and pressed my hand against the side panel of the van. The metal was so hot it pulled my gloves' leather taut against my skin. Inside I could hear something, not mechanical, not the cooling unit or the engine, a sound like respiration, deep, slow, enormous. The van itself seemed to expand and contract with each cycle. The suspension creaked in rhythm. The phone in my pocket buzzed, a text from an unknown number. No name, no caller ID, just a message. The route is ready, please begin. I want to say I hesitated. I want to say I stood in the driveway and weighed my options, considered the rational choice, thought about walking away. But the truth is simpler and stranger than that. The truth is that the message felt like relief. Someone was coordinating. Someone was managing this. The phantom arrangements weren't random overflow from a broken system. They were inventory for a delivery run that had been scheduled by someone, somewhere. And all I had to do was drive. I got in the cab. The passenger seat held a clipboard. Not my clipboard. A wooden clipboard with a metal clasp, old and worn smooth along the edges. A delivery manifest was clipped to it, handwritten in Marin Selby's angular pencil script. 17 cemeteries listed in order, same as my route. Beside each cemetery name, a number. Green Hill, 34. Calvary Hill, 22. Holly Creek, 19. Oak Hill, 41. The numbers continued down the list. I added them in my head. 308 arrangements. Every entry on Marin's list of forgotten dead, plus 97 new names I didn't recognize. 97 people who had been forgotten since 2006. 20 years of additional dead with no one left to remember them. The total delivery count was impossible for one van, one driver, one morning. I knew that before I turned the key. 308 arrangements across 17 cemeteries in a 90-minute window. Even without the logistics of physical space and driving time, the math was absurd. But the van started. The engine caught on the first try, which it hadn't done reliably since December. The heating system, which had been broken for weeks, filled the cab with warm air that smelled like carnations. I pulled out of my driveway at 4:17 a.m. The first cemetery, Green Hill, was 12 minutes away. I drove the familiar roads in darkness. The fog was heavier than usual, sitting in the valleys like standing water, and my headlights barely cut 20 feet into it. The radio was off, and the only sound was the engine and that deep, slow respiration from the cargo area behind me. Breathing, steady and patient. When I arrived at Green Hill and opened the cargo door, the van was organized, not packed chaotically as I'd expected. Every bouquet was upright, spaced evenly, accessible. The cargo area looked larger than it should have been. I could see all the way to the back wall, and the back wall seemed farther away than the physical dimensions of the van allowed. I didn't measure. I didn't want to measure. I reached in and took the first arrangement. The paper was warm but bearable. The tag read, Green Hill, Section C, Row 12, Harlan Cobb. Kind, Harlan Cobb, the man from Marin's first entry in 1979, the widower who had thanked her for the roses. He must have died sometime in the years since. His wife was already buried at Green Hill, and now he was beside her, and no one was left to bring flowers to either of them. No one except this. I carried the first arrangement through the fog to Section C, Row 12. The headstone was easy to find. A double marker, husband and wife. Harlan David Cobb, 1922 to 2004. Grace Ellen Cobb, 1924 to 1978. I placed the bouquet between their names and stood in the dark with my hands tingling from the heat and the fog pressing against my face like wet cloth. 33 more arrangements waited in the van for Green Hill alone. What happened next is difficult to describe because it violates everything I understand about time and physical space. I carried 34 arrangements from my van to 34 graves at Green Hill Memorial Gardens. Each arrangement had a tag with a section, row, name, and single-word description. Each grave was exactly where the tag said it would be. Even graves I had never seen before. Even graves in sections I didn't know existed. The fog parted where I walked and closed behind me. My feet found paths between headstones that seemed to have been cleared for this purpose. The grass shorter, the ground firmer, as if someone had mowed and graded a delivery route through the cemetery overnight. I completed a Green Hill in 14 minutes. 34 arrangements. 14 minutes. That is not physically possible. The cemetery covers 19 acres. Section C alone is a 5-minute walk from the gate. I know this because I walk it twice a week, but that morning the distance is compressed. My steps covered more ground than they should have. The cemetery folded itself into a manageable route, and I moved through it with an efficiency that felt less like speed and more like cooperation. The place was helping me. When I returned to the van after the last Green Hill delivery, the cargo door was already open. The next group of arrangements, 22 for Calvary Hill, had moved to the front of the cargo area, ready. I drove to Calvary Hill. The roads between cemeteries were empty, not just quiet. Empty in a way that felt intentional, as if the county's infrastructure had been cleared for me. No other headlights, no farm trucks pulling onto the highway, no deer in the ditches. The fog held everything in a gray suspension, and my van moved through it with a smoothness that didn't match the road surface. I knew these roads. I knew every pothole on Route 86, every frost heave on the county connector between Green Hill and Calvary Hill. That morning, the asphalt felt new, seamless, like driving on a surface that had been poured an hour ago. Calvary Hill took 11 minutes. 22 arrangements placed on 22 forgotten graves. Same precision, same tags, same impossible efficiency. The cemetery cooperated the way Green Hill had. Paths appeared. Distances shrank. My body moved without fatigue. without the lower back pain that normally started by the fourth cemetery, without the cold stiffness in my fingers that March mornings always brought. The warmth from the bouquets traveled up my arms and settled in my chest like a second heartbeat. Holly Creek, 19 arrangements, 9 minutes. The little rural cemetery with its low stone wall was barely visible in the fog, but every grave on the manifest was findable, every headstone legible despite decades of weathering. My flashlight illuminated inscriptions I'd never been able to read before, names and dates emerging from lichen and erosion as if the stone was remembering its own text for the occasion. Oak Hill, 41 arrangements, the largest delivery of the run. Oak Hill was the oldest cemetery on my route, established in 1803, with sections that predated the county itself, graves from the settlement era, wooden markers that should have rotted to nothing a century ago but somehow persisted. I walked rows I'd never walked before, deeper into the cemetery than the maintained grounds extended, into a zone where the trees grew between the graves and the headstones, tilted at angles that suggested the earth beneath them had shifted and resettled many times. The fog was thicker here. It didn't part for me the way it had at the other cemeteries. It guided me. Tendrils of it curled around my ankles and led me forward. And I followed because there was nothing in it that felt hostile. It felt like being led by the hand. Loretta Cates, row 7 of the old section. My great-great-grandmother's grave was marked by a thin limestone slab so weathered that only the first and last letters of her name were visible. The tag on her arrangement read, Oak Hill, old section, row 7, Loretta Cates, steady. I placed the bouquet against the headstone, white carnations, a sprig of dried wheat, rosemary. The paper was so hot it should have scorched the flowers, but they were perfect, unwilted, unbothered by the heat, as if the warmth was theirs and the paper was just carrying it. I stood at Loretta's grave for longer than I stood at any other, not because I felt a connection, not because I experienced some ancestral recognition or spiritual communion, because I wanted to be the kind of person who would have visited this grave without being directed to it by a phantom delivery service. I wanted to have been better. My family had forgotten this woman, completely. Her name survived only in county records and in a list compiled by a flower shop owner who vanished 20 years ago. Without Marin's notebook, without the bouquets, without whatever engine of remembrance was powering this entire operation, Loretta Cates would have been nothing. A stone sinking into the ground, letters dissolving back into limestone, a life reduced to geology. The remaining cemeteries blurred together, not in memory but in experience. The route became a single, continuous act of delivery. I moved through the fog and the dark and the cooperating landscape, placing arrangements on graves with tags that told me where to go and single words that told me who these people had been. Brave, gentle, stubborn, faithful, quiet, proud, grieving, joyful, lonely, forgiving. Some words appeared more than once. Kind was the most common. 43 of the 308 dead had been kind, according to whatever authority was making this determination. At the 16th Cemetery, Ridgeline Baptist, a small churchyard plot at the end of a dirt road that I normally dreaded for its inaccessibility, I found a grave that wasn't on Marin's original list. The tag read, Ridgeline Baptist, East Wall, Marin Selby, devoted. I stopped walking. East Wall. The cemetery backed up against the hillside, and a retaining wall of stacked fieldstone ran along its eastern boundary. I'd never delivered to this section. The graves here were the oldest in the churchyard, most of them unmarked. I walked along the wall with my flashlight until I found it. A modest granite marker, newer than the surrounding stones, set flush with the ground. The inscription was simple. Marin Elise Selby, born April 9th, 1941, died November 16th, 2006. November 16th, the day after her last diary entry, the day the X marks on her calendar stopped. She hadn't left. She hadn't disappeared. She had died, right here in Hardin County, buried in a churchyard cemetery on her own delivery route. And nobody knew because nobody had thought to check these small, unmaintained plots for a fresh grave in November of 2006. Or maybe somebody did know. Maybe the system that managed this, whatever it was, had managed her burial the way it managed everything else. Quietly, without paperwork, without the mechanisms that the living use to record death. She had been on her own list all along, one of the forgotten dead, receiving flowers from the same source she had spent 27 years serving. The arrangement I placed on her grave was the most elaborate of the entire run, a cascading piece built around white roses and trailing ivy, with carnations tucked deep in the center where they wouldn't be visible from above. You'd have to kneel to see them. You'd have to get close to the ground, close to where Marin was, to notice the honest flowers she loved, hidden inside something beautiful. The paper around her bouquet wasn't hot. It was the warmth of a living hand. I held it against my chest before placing it, and for a few seconds the entire cemetery was silent. Not quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no fog moving. A complete cessation of ambient sound, as if the world had paused to observe the delivery. Then the silence broke gently, with the sound of a bird I couldn't identify singing a three-note phrase from somewhere in the trees above the wall. It sang it once and stopped. The 17th cemetery was mine in 4 minutes. Fog retreating, first light coming. The van's cargo area was empty for the first time in months. Truly empty. No phantom bouquets. No residual warmth. The air inside smelled like cold metal and rubber, the way a cargo van is supposed to smell. The wooden clipboard was gone from the passenger seat. The manifest was gone. The only evidence that the night had happened was the lingering tingle in my hands and the faint impression of Marin's handwriting behind my eyes when I blinked. I drove back to my apartment as the sun came up. The fog burned away. The roads filled with commuters and school buses and delivery trucks. The ordinary infrastructure of morning reasserted itself. By the time I parked, the van's suspension had returned to normal height. The cargo door opened without resistance. Inside, my standard wholesale order for the Thursday route sat in its usual arrangement, undisturbed, as if the 308 bouquets had never existed. But they had. I drove back to 3 of the cemeteries that afternoon. Green Hill, Holly Creek, Oak Hill. The arrangements were there, every single one. Fresh flowers on forgotten graves, warming in the March sun. A groundskeeper at Green Hill, a different man from Dale, was standing at the gate when I arrived. He looked at the flowers covering the cemetery and then looked at me. "You do all this?" he asked. "Not alone," I said. He nodded, as if that answered everything he needed to know. That was 3 years ago. The route continues. The phantom bouquets continue, though they've returned to their previous frequency. 2 or 3 per run. Warm paper. No invoices. Always finding their way to forgotten graves. The annual surge hasn't repeated. I think March 3rd was a reset. A system clearing its backlog. 20 years of accumulation, from the gap between Marin's death and my arrival, all the flowers that should have been delivered to all the dead who should have been remembered. The system waited for someone willing to carry them. I still have Marin's notebook. I've added my own entries in the back, in pen, because I don't trust pencil to last. I've expanded the list of forgotten dead. It grows faster than I expected. People die and are forgotten with a speed that should be impossible in a county this small, but forgetting is the natural state of things. Remembering is the anomaly. Remembering requires effort, maintenance, someone willing to drive before dawn with a van full of flowers and place them on stones that no one else will visit. I drove out to Route 86 last month. The building is still there, still boarded up, still smelling of fresh flowers through the warped plywood. The county directory still lists Selby's Florals and Remembrance as active. Denise at the clerk's office retired in 2024, and her replacement told me the same thing Denise had. The listing won't change. The system won't let it. I've made peace with that. Some systems are older than their software. Some databases remember things because the things they're recording haven't actually ended. Marin Selby's business is closed the way a heart is closed between beats, temporarily, rhythmically, as part of a cycle that doesn't require the owner to be alive to continue. The flowers come from somewhere I can't see, made by hands I can't identify, for the dead that no one else will honor. My job is delivery. My job has always been delivery. The van, the route, the early hours, the fog, the threshold light between night and morning when the world is soft enough to accept impossible things without breaking. I inherited this the way you inherit a family trait. Not by choice, by proximity. By being the kind of person who shows up before dawn and does the work without needing to understand it. My mother asked me last Christmas if I was happy. We were sitting in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd woken me for school during the threshold hour, and I thought about the question longer than she expected. I'm useful, I told her. She nodded. She understood the difference. Happiness is a thing you feel. Usefulness is a thing you are. The flowers don't need me to be happy. They need me to be reliable, to start the van at 4:15, to drive the route, to carry what appears and place it where it belongs, to not ask questions that the work has already answered. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I wake in the dark and dress in the quiet of an apartment that smells faintly of carnations, even though I've never brought flowers home. The van is in the driveway. The engine starts. The route unfolds. Between stops, in that gray light that isn't night and isn't morning, I sometimes feel the passenger seat shift, a slight depression in the cushion, a warmth beside me that has no source. I don't look. I don't need to look. Marin Selby rode this route for 27 years. I don't think she ever stopped. The flowers are warm. They are always warm. And the dead, every single one of them, are remembered by something that refuses to forget. My hands tingle on the steering wheel. The road ahead is fog and patience. The cargo door will open when it's time, and what needs to be delivered will be there, wrapped in paper from a shop that the county says is still open. I'm beginning to think the county's right.